Hey, Larken Rose here. A popular topic among some pro-freedom people is the supposedly imminent collapse of the U.S. empire. And I rarely talk about that, but I thought I'd do a video about that, covering a few different things. The first thing I want to cover is the people who are sort of... they basically just say, I want to watch it all burn and watch everything collapse and everything go back to caveman style of existence. If you actually are looking forward to and excited about a situation in which millions and millions of people are terrified and suffering and starving, you're a crappy person. And unfortunately, there are some crappy people in the freedom movement who seem to genuinely want widespread suffering. Now, if someone's talking about just the collapse of the authoritarian monstrosity, okay, fine. But I know a bunch of people who are like, I want all of society to collapse and totally be mayhem. Now, if someone's just predicting that, not wanting it, but saying, well, I expect that to happen, okay, that's a different thing. But the people are like, I just want to watch it burn. And, some people say it jokingly, the people who joke about, voting for giant meteor for president in 2020 or whatever. I know people, some people just flippantly joke about that, like this clown world has gotten so ridiculous, just forget it. But there are some people who actually delight in the idea of sort of a cataclysmic collapse of society and people starving to death and every man for himself in chaos. So, number one, the people who delight in that idea, you're kind of screwed up. Number two, thankfully, that isn't going to happen. So, is the U.S. empire going to collapse? Yep. Like every empire does. Now, I wanted to talk about a few things regarding why I think this particular collapse will be different than the collapse of the Roman Empire, the collapse of the British Empire, similar in some ways and different in some ways, and why I think it's actually an outstanding opportunity. Now, first of all, even the British Empire and the Roman Empire, when they collapsed, it didn't mean that everyone inside the territory of the British Empire, they are all starved and died. No, they didn't. The control over them fell apart. That messed up a bunch of stuff. And when one set of power-happy psychos moves out, often another set of power-happy psychos tries to move in and becomes the new authority, which works if the people believe in authority and government and think they need a ruler, then people bicker about who it is. Incidentally, statists like to point to that and go, see what happens when you don't have a government? They point to Somalia, which, by the way, has had a government forever. But they point to situations where there's different, warring factions fighting over who gets to be the ruling class and saying, see, that's what happens when you don't have government. No. The goal of a population that doesn't believe in ruling classes doesn't end up with a bunch of people fighting over who gets to be the ruling class that nobody believes in. But anyway, when an empire collapses, like when Rome collapsed, it doesn't mean, everybody dies, or, it means the power structure collapses, and a bunch of these places that were, formerly under control, there can be turmoil and confusion because their control over us sort of left, and you get the weird thing, same with the British Empire, where if in a certain place a certain group of authoritarian buttheads like the British were controlling it, like a bunch of places in Africa and over in India, and then they pull out or they stop being there can sort of be chaos, and temporarily small-time crooks and thugs can go, well, cool, now we can beat people up because the people who used to stop us aren't there. So yes, it can make instability and stuff like that. And when the U.S. empire falls, as it will absolutely do, it will make some instability, especially in the big cities. And the reason I say that is big cities are always they're always dependent upon a huge amount of other places supplying them with food and water and power and stuff. I mean, sometimes the water and power can come from nearby, but if you take something like New York City, nobody's like growing enough food inside New York City to feed the people of New York City. A ridiculously huge amount of food is produced throughout the rest of the country and throughout the rest of the world, because at this point we have a global market in all sorts of kinds of food. So that city, if you just put a wall around it and nobody could get in and out, they'd all starve to death like really damn quickly, except for like 3 preppers who have piles of soup cans in their basement or something. But it needs a whole bunch of outside, so you need a sophisticated, complex outside supply of food and a bunch of other things. Like they're not making their own gasoline there. Like that comes from oil fields that are not in New York City. So there's a bunch of things that if they're not constantly being supplied to a big city, the big city, has serious trouble. And that can cause like giant catastrophes. Whereas if you're talking about people out in the country, if the power network, the electric grid collapses and the communication collapses and, a bunch of things that actually aren't going to happen, which I'll get into in a minute. But it's not that difficult for them to go, okay, well, we live out here, like rural Pennsylvania is a place I've driven through a million times. There's a ton of farmers. They know how to grow stuff. They know how to hunt deer. They're probably going to be just fine, even if all of the infrastructure collapses. But the people in like the middle of Philadelphia, they're kind of screwed if there isn't a continuing influx of food and power and all that stuff. So when there's a sudden shakeup of an interference of the supply chain of things like food, cities are the worst place to be, just on a practical basis. Now, here are some things about the collapse of the U.S. empire. I'm not even going to bother to try to talk you into the fact that every empire collapses or even get into the details of why. I mean, it's kind of oversimplified to say, well, they stretch their tentacles too far and then can't keep up with it and then just sort of collapse under their own weight. But that's what happens. What's happened to the Roman Empire, it happened to the British Empire. They pushed too far. Eventually, they lost control of their own colonies and sort of fizzled down. I mean, England still exists, but now it's like this big instead of, a third of the world or something. It was just ridiculously huge at some point. So, if you think that the U.S. empire is going to continue forever, all right, I'm not going to try to talk you out of that in this video. But if you accept the inevitable pattern of empires always collapsing, I wanted to cover why I think it's going to be so different this time and why I think it's going to be a lot less painful and a unique opportunity for humanity. Now, first of all, even though there are, like I was saying, the places in big cities where they're very dependent on other people supplying them with food and whatever else, all of the people involved, like this is one thing that even pro-freedom people, it's like they don't think about it very much. It's like, oh, well, if government collapses, there won't be electricity and there won't be roads. And like all of the people who do all of that, none of them are congressmen. The people who make the power plants work, whether it's nuclear, hydroelectric, whatever you're talking about, they're just people. The people who maintain the power lines, they're just people. The people who, run do the oil wells and the oil processing plants to make gasoline, they're just people. Congressmen aren't doing that. It's just people fixing the roads. Like it's people I know. It's just people building bridges. Now, in between, if the funding for some of these things used to go through government to hire those people, there can be a temporary confusion and delay about, oh no, what are we going to do? But the idea, basically people who think all the infrastructure will collapse when government goes, are basically suggesting that none of this can work without robbers. Because literally the only thing government adds to the equation is robbery. They're not adding the wealth. Like, they rob all of us by way of taxation. Then they pay normal people to build a road or to fix a pothole or repair a bridge or something. Those people still exist. The equipment still exists. The know-how still exists. Congress isn't any of that. They don't know how to do anything. They're not supplying any of the funds. Like, yeah, they write the check after they steal it from us. So if they're not stealing it from us and not wasting 90% of it through corruption and stupidity, everything needed to fix that bridge or build a road or maintain this power plant, that's all just us. That's all the normal people. Congressmen aren't doing that. Tax collectors aren't doing that. Bureaucrats aren't doing that. Working people are doing that. And the mentality of Americans has been demonstrated time and time again to be very quickly adaptive to a new situation. Now, not all Americans, obviously. A lot of Americans are clueless and spoiled and have no idea how to do anything remotely productive and sit on their asses and play video games all day. Don't do anything else. But a huge number of Americans actually know how to make things work. I mean, even in war, which shouldn't happen and is only a result of the belief in government, there were a lot of examples of American ingenuity coming up with weird inventions of how to better kill people or avoid being killed. And it's pretty sad that, like, that's the expression of genius. Now we're better at murdering people. But the fact that American ingenuity is a phrase that people use, there's a reason for that. And there's a lot of real-world examples you can point to when there's suddenly a huge flood or an earthquake or a hurricane or something and a big area is messed up. And the people in the area realize, well, government's not going to save our butts. We have to, like, jump on our boat and go help people. And then you get things like Hurricane Katrina, where government literally just got in the way of people helping people. But all the actual help was just done by productive people in spite of interference by politicians and thugs of the state. So yeah, thugs of the state literally managed to prevent good people from helping other people, but all of the actual solutions were just people. And in a case where it's suddenly, our town is suddenly under 20 feet of water, like, everybody, if you have a boat, get in your boat, go around, find people on their roofs and save them. Fresh water is in short supply whenever this happens. So, deal with, truckloads of stuff coming in, people donating just billions of dollars. It happens literally every time in this country. People from across the country will donate millions and billions of dollars to, whoa, that would suck to be down there. Even people who don't live anywhere near it and aren't directly affected by it chip in and help out, and normal people do it. And that's when they have, like, almost no advanced warning and didn't organize ahead of time, and suddenly there's this catastrophe. That's, like, the worst possible scenario, and still people find ways to fix it. So the idea that when it's not an emergency and everything isn't underwater, we don't know how to fix a pothole, or we don't know how to build a bridge, and only through the gracious wisdom and benevolence of politicians can those things happen, that's ridiculous. And it's funny because you already see examples. I mean, freaking Pizza Hut. Pizza Hut did this brilliant thing where they went around filling in potholes and putting the Pizza Hut logo on it. It was genius. It's like, cool, everybody's happy, good, there aren't 50 million potholes. There's even a video of Mr. Screw Your Freedom Schwarzenegger, statist jackass that he is, getting tired of some pothole in his hoity-toity neighborhood, and him and some people went and filled it in. Okay? Like, does anybody think normal people aren't capable of that? Like, you might not know how to work with blacktop. Lots of people might not know how. But the people who know how to work with blacktop aren't politicians, and they're not tax collectors, and they're not paper pushers in government agencies. They're just people, and they're still going to be there. So if government literally just fell into the ocean tomorrow, if DC just rolled into the Atlantic, oh my gosh, well, there aren't tons of checks going to mostly useless people who aren't producing anything. For the productive sector of humanity, who gives a crap? Like, what do you think that's going to mess up? And you can say, well, there's the Department of Transportation. Okay, but all the people who did it, most of them were private contractors anyway. Like at the state level, at least, where the people are still there, the equipment's still there, the know-how's still there. It's like, well, the thing that used to pay us just fell into the ocean, but these roads are falling apart. Do we want to arrange a way to pay these people to fix this? As if that's all that difficult a thing to do. And so, first of all, the collapse of the empire in this case doesn't mean everything falls apart. It basically means, well, this giant annoying bureaucracy that gets in the way of everything, it's going to fall apart. And a whole bunch of people who live off of stolen loot are going to be in deep shit. There are going to be a lot of people on welfare who have been trained to be useless and whine for a handout from government who may very well be in deep shit. Now, luckily for them, they're in a country full of very generous people who, even after being robbed to fund a giant welfare state, voluntarily donate a whole lot. Unluckily for them, if they're sitting on their ass because they're lazy, lots of people are going to go, I don't want you to pay you to sit on your ass and be lazy. If you're actually in a situation where, through no fault of your own, you're having trouble getting by and you need help, there are 80 gazillion Americans, whether individuals or corporate donors or churches, as much as people like to complain about them, who give tons of money to people to help them out. But if you're just sitting around going, well, I want my free money, they might go, well, tough crap. Like, make yourself useful. Produce something. Like, if you don't have an excuse, don't be a freeloader. If there's actually something wrong and it's through no fault of your own, we'll help you out. So the collapse of the empire will be obviously very troublesome for all the parasites, all the politicians, all the people who worked at the IRS, and screw you, you deserve to have a hellish life as you try to learn how to do something actually useful after having a career where you literally punish people for being productive so you can steal their money and give it to worthless people like the politicians. Yeah, politicians will be in trouble. Bureaucrats will be in trouble. A lot of recipients of stolen loot will be in trouble, whether it's government employees or a bunch of welfare recipients, including corporate welfare recipients. Oh no, if we don't get our huge bailout, we might collapse. Good, crash and burn, you jackass. All those giant corporations and banks that keep getting bailed out over and over again, they're going to be in trouble. And I don't give a crap, because then reality will actually create an incentive for those people to learn how to actually be productive and produce something of value. That doesn't mean, oh my gosh, the infrastructure and food and everything's going to collapse. No, it isn't. All the productive stuff isn't going to suffer at all. It's literally you pulled a leech off of it. It's like, oh, that animal, I'm scared of what's going to happen to that animal if we pull the giant leech off of it. The leech is going to be in bad shape. The animal will be fine. In fact, it'll be better than fine. You will unleash an amount of productivity and energy and freedom and excess wealth. I sort of hate that term. But if you're not robbing everybody, they have way more money to buy things or to help people or to invest in things in a million different ways. So I think this empire right now, we are in a unique situation in that the collapse of the ruling power will not mean a threat to the actual productivity and lifestyle of the productive people. It'll be a threat to the people who now live off of the parasitic ruling class. But even they can very quickly, once they realize, yeah, you better get off your butt and find a way to be useful to your fellow man, they can find a way to do that. It's still ridiculously prosperous. All the technology is still here. All the machinery is here. All the know-how is here. All the productive people, that's already us. That's not politicians. It never was. But one of the most important things about the I'm not sure I would call it imminent collapse of the empire. I don't think it's going to happen next year. It's going to be pretty soon, but I don't know exactly when. And the thing is, it's hard to say an exact time. It's not like Rome just suddenly went poof, like, oh, it was here yesterday and now it isn't. The Soviet Union almost did that, where one day they just said, yeah, if we just give up, bye. But even that was a decline. Like the fact that's what it appeared as in the news of just, well, yesterday there was this massive superpower and now they're just gone. Yeah, it's not really what happened, even though that's what it looked like in the news. But whether you're talking about that or the Roman Empire or the British Empire, it's not just one day they're gone, but it's they lose control and fall apart and all that. The thing that matters this time around, and the reason why I think it will be an amazing opportunity, is because throughout most of history, almost everybody had been very deep in the authoritarian mindset. So as soon as one king collapses, everybody's like, well, who's the rightful king? And people kill each other and stab each other, and there's assassinations, and oh, now she's the rightful queen, or the prince is the rightful king, and you have a big Game of Thrones thing, which, by the way, the whole premise of that is kind of brilliant and genius, including the title, because that's most of history, the Game of Thrones. It's a game fighting over who gets to sit on the throne, and if everybody accepts the legitimacy of the throne, they're all sitting there going, gee, I wonder who's going to stomp on me tomorrow. And they all accept the premise that they should have a ruler, that that's legitimate. Now, the beauty is that this time around, first of all, lots of people are already becoming voluntarists. We're still a minority of the population, obviously. But a lot of people are giving up the belief in statism. But there's a difference between the overall belief in authoritarian power and a feeling of loyalty to a particular ruling class. And an example I've pointed out before is people talk about, what if China invades? And I've said this on many occasions. It would be sort of interesting and funny if China invades, because what would happen is all these Americans who put up with being subjugated and controlled and continually robbed and bossed around and limited in every aspect of their lives would suddenly fight against that, not because they have anything like a principled philosophy, but because if their tormentors happen to be Chinese, suddenly they would righteously defend themselves. Whereas if their abusers and exploiters are American, who got voted into office, kinda sorta, then they feel obligated to obey. The only difference would be Americans will not feel an obligation to bow to China or Russia or the UN. They'll actually defend themselves, some of them, enough of them, against an invading force, which literally means the only force capable of robbing and extorting and controlling the American people is the one already doing it, which is the one that too many Americans view as their rightful government. Our great constitutional republic, I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic. You're pledging allegiance to a ruling class. And that indoctrination makes them loyal to that, but it doesn't just make them loyal to anybody who stops by. And the reason I bring that up is if the U.S. government falls over, and the state governments may bicker and some of them may fall over and people can be moving around, if the U.S. government falls over, the mentality of the American people, including a whole lot of conservatives who are totally statist, if somebody else comes along and says, we're your new rulers, the people are going to say, no, you're not. And by the way, we have a lot of guns here. So, no, you're stinking not. I am your king. Bam! No, you're not. I'm your king. Bam! No, you're not. And the next guy's like, never mind, I'm not your king. Bye. Because if they don't feel loyalty to a particular ruling class, they will resist being robbed and dominated and controlled. It's taken a mass amount of indoctrination to make these people who are in their day-to-day lives, they think they're like independent and free and rah, rah, rah. It's taken a massive amount of indoctrination to make them feel a loyalty to the particular ruling class robbing them right now. Our glorious, democratically elected constitutional republic. It's like, yeah, it's a bunch of thieving crooks who duped you into thinking there's something other than just thieving crooks. But another gang coming along saying, now we're the new ones in charge of you. Weirdly, the nationalism of Americans, as statist as it is, makes them kind of immune from some other power saying, now we're in charge, because there's a hell of a lot of Americans who are armed who will say, no, you're not. So if DC fell into the ocean and Chinese army showed up, they all get shot and die. Russian army shows up, they all get shot and die. UN shows up with their stupid light blue helmets, they all get shot and die. Because Americans, including a huge number of people who now take pride in being subservient to the American ruling class, wouldn't put up with being subservient to anybody else. Which is stupid and unprincipled and hypocritical, but on a practical level, it's kind of advantageous for when this empire falls. At the same time, the number of people who are giving up their belief in authority entirely, like, most of the people I'm talking to right now, you already know, I don't really need to tell you this, that when you understand self-ownership and non-aggression and stuff like that, it doesn't mean it's easy to live free, because you're surrounded by people who believe in a ruling class, and a ruling class and its thugs who will beat you up if they get a chance, if they catch you not bowing to the political parasites. So it's still a challenge. Like, you're supposed to be free and that it's not legitimate. That doesn't remove the threat. And you have to decide, how much you're going to go along with, at what level will you, resist or disobey and stuff like that. Well, if the empire falls over, then it's like, well, now there's nobody I need to resist or disobey. That's handy. And if a new set of control freaks comes in, suddenly the vast majority of the people who were against you 2 seconds ago because you wouldn't bow to the American ruling class, they're suddenly on your side. A huge number of armed conservative rednecks and everybody else are like, well, I ain't putting up with the UN coming in here. Okay, good for you. I wish you had that same rebellious spirit when it came to the Americans robbing you and bossing you around and treating you like cattle. But at least you'd resist somebody. The reason that's so important is because that mentality, combined with the collapse of a particular ruling class, will create a situation that I don't know of anything like it in the history of humanity. Now, if you go back enough thousands of years where I don't even know what the hell happened, and I don't know that anybody does, maybe that's happened before. But when you have a huge population that's armed, which is really important, like people in England, you gave away your guns. People in Australia, you gave away your guns. People in Canada, you gave away your guns. Not entirely, not all of them. But the American people don't. It's like the one thing that actually makes this place different is every time they're like pushing for gun control, a bunch of Americans run out and buy more guns. So yeah, you're not disarming this place no matter what you do. Which means when this empire falls, if there's any significant percentage, not a majority, but just any significant percentage of the population that actually has the leave me alone mentality, they will actually have the support of all their conservative neighbors, whose support they wouldn't have if they're saying, I'm not paying taxes to the IRS or to the state or to the local bozos now. Because then the conservatives will say, well, then you're a criminal and you should be put in prison. But when the day comes where that falls over and some foreigner says, we're going to rule you, and the same voluntary says, I'm not paying tribute to you, suddenly all the conservatives are on their side. Yeah, we're not paying tribute either. And despite the hypocrisy and silliness of that, that creates a situation where when this particular ruling class loses its power and loses its legitimacy in the eyes of its victims, which we are careening towards that at top speed, nobody in the world is going to be able to subjugate the American people. Because if you don't at least have a huge portion of them believing they have an obligation to obey, you're just screwed. You can't conquer a people that doesn't think you have the right to rule them and owns 300 million guns. Good freaking luck. And that's going to happen when the U.S. empire falls. Now, the federal government may fall first and the states may play their games and people may move around, and like California is already falling apart at the seams and will probably continue to do that because the idiot commies there didn't learn their lesson and continue to make matters worse. So it's not like all the state governments will fall apart at the same time, but at whatever, in whatever order, at whatever speed things fall apart, there is still an underlying spirit of freedom in spite of the statism that's on top of that in most Americans' minds, because there is. All the flag wavers, like you're literally waving the symbol of your oppressor. Why are you doing that? 'Cause freedom. But when that particular empire is gone, then they will actually believe in freedom. And if some random person comes along and claims the right to rule, then they're suddenly going to be on the side of the voluntarists and anarchists. And in that situation, not only on a practical basis will they be able to resist, but when the God they were taught to bow to, the United States government, isn't there anymore, so they don't feel a loyalty to it because it collapsed, and they're like, oh well, whatever. I don't know what happened to Congress, but like nobody's there, and I don't know what's going on. Their mentality and their philosophy will be so ripe to finally open their ears to the voluntarists who say, okay, now that they're gone, are you obligated to bow to anybody else? No. Good, because it takes a massive amount of time and effort to convince people like that they have an obligation to bow to a certain regime. You can't do that overnight. You can't do it in a week. You can't do it in a year. It's a lifelong indoctrination process, which makes Americans, A, think that they're free, and B, feel like they have an obligation to be law-abiding taxpayers, which is like most conservatives. You can't just do that to a different regime. Like if tomorrow you said, okay, well, U.S. government, it fell over, it's in the ocean or whatever. But now we're all obligated to listen to like the government of China. Nobody's going to believe that. Now, the funny thing is that the idea that we're obligated to obey that ruling class is no more ridiculous than the idea that we're obligated to bow to these crooks. But thinking we're obligated to bow to these crooks, the American crooks, that's what most conservatives believe in today from indoctrination. But they don't believe the other one. So when a king, the equivalent of a king, dies, and his subjects who thought, well, he is our rightful lord and king, suddenly think, well, he had no heir, so nobody's our king now, that will be a unique situation, as far as I know, in which people can actually change their mentality to believing in real freedom, where nobody will be able to show up and convince them, no, we're your rightful lords and masters. Like, no, you're not. By the way, we're heavily armed, so please go away so we don't have to shoot you. And so I think the fall, it's sort of coincidental, but I think the timing of it makes it so that the fall of the American empire will mean the beginning of massive widespread stateless society in a lot of places in this country, which will stop being a country, and then in other places all over the world, just because of that opportunity. It's sort of like a jailbreak. Like if you have a bunch of people in prison, if a bunch of them know they shouldn't be in prison and some of them think they should, well, they're still all in prison. But if the door gets opened and they can get away, the ones who think they're supposed to be in prison wander out and go, hey, they're not keeping us in prison. And the ones who know they weren't supposed to be in prison, like, good luck catching them again because they're not going to go quietly. And that's what it's going to be like. The door of the prison is going to be open when the U.S. empire falls. And the people who are already voluntarists are going to be voluntarists. And the people who are now conservatives are going to turn into voluntarists because they won't feel an obligation to any other ruling class. And because of that, I think the fall of the empire, not only will it not be some big, horrible, suffering mayhem like back to Stone Age type of existence, I think in record time, people will adjust and adapt, and this country, even though it may not be a country anymore by definition, because country means the territorial jurisdiction of a national ruling class, will become more prosperous and free than it has ever been almost overnight. Not quite overnight, because that's not how empires collapse. But instead of, everything's going to fall apart and it's going to be like Mad Max, no, it's just going to be what this place should have been if people actually believed in freedom the whole time. And people will adjust so quickly, where we already have the technology, we already have the prosperity, we already have all the productive people. They already know how to do it. We have a bunch of unproductive people who are stupid, and we have a bunch of people who are parasites of the state. But they're going to basically have to learn how to get off their butts and do something worthwhile and useful. Because them voting for a new ruling class isn't going to make all the other people go, oh, well, we'll bow to whatever crook you put there. When this empire goes, they're not bound to anybody. And so anyway, that is my prediction. I don't know exactly when, but that's why I'm not at all scared of the collapse of this empire. It's not going to be horrible and painful and dreadful suffering. There will be some people who have a hard time of it. The people who are now not at all productive and have been trained to have an entitlement mentality, and they've been rewarded for being useless to their fellow man for way too long. Some of them are going to have a hard time of it. But overall, the economy and the productive people, they're going to do fine when the giant leech shrivels up and dies. And instead of it meaning a collapse of civilization, it'll literally just mean a freeing of civilization. And that's why I'm not at all worried about the collapse of the U.S. empire. I'm looking forward to it.